Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into a strangely intimate mystery, one that lives much closer than distant galaxies or ancient stars. We're going to explore a question that hides inside your own head, gently and patiently. Where do the two consciousnesses in your mind come from? Before you settle in completely, feel free to lower the lights. Maybe let a soft hum fill the room and allow your breathing to slow. If you enjoy these calm explorations, you're always welcome to like this video or subscribe, but only if it feels right to you. And when you're ready, you can leave a comment sharing where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's a small reminder that this quiet moment is shared across many places and many nights. As we begin, there's no need to concentrate too hard. If your attention drifts, that's perfectly fine. This story doesn't demand sharp focus. It unfolds slowly, like a thought that keeps going even as you begin to rest. Tonight, we'll wonder together whether the feeling of being a single, unified you might actually be the result of something more complex, perhaps even a gentle negotiation happening inside your brain moment by moment. And with that thought resting lightly in the background, we can begin. Take a moment to picture the human brain, not as a diagram from a textbook, but as something physical and real, resting quietly inside your skull. It has weight, it has texture, and most strikingly, it has symmetry. Your brain is divided down the middle into two large halves, the left and the right, shaped so similarly that at first glance they seem almost redundant, like a building constructed with two wings that mirror each other perfectly, connected by a long, narrow hallway. Architects rarely design such structures without a reason, and nature, as it turns out, is no different. For a long time, scientists wondered why evolution would take the trouble to build the brain this way. After all, it turns out that a person can survive, and sometimes function surprisingly well, with only one hemisphere. If one half can do the job, why keep two? This question becomes even more unsettling when we learn that the two halves are not just copies. They are similar, yes, but not identical in what they tend to do best. One side is more comfortable with language and careful analysis. The other is more at ease with spatial awareness, emotional tone, and broad patterns. They cooperate constantly, exchanging information so seamlessly that most of the time you never notice the handoff. Most of the time. But cooperation doesn't always mean unity. Imagine two people working together on a long project. They share notes, pass messages back and forth, and usually agree on what needs to be done next. From the outside, it looks like a single coordinated effort. Yet each person still has their own perspective, their own preferences, their own silent opinions. Now imagine that the line of communication between them was suddenly cut. The shared project wouldn't disappear, but the harmony might. This is where the quiet question begins to form. If the two halves of your brain can process information independently, and if each half has its own strengths, memories, and ways of interpreting the world, then what exactly creates the feeling that there is only one you inside your head? Is consciousness something that lives in a single place, like a pilot in a cockpit? Or is it something that emerges from cooperation, an agreement rather than a ruler? To approach this question gently, it helps to let go of the idea that consciousness must be a solid object. Instead, think of it as a process, more like a melody than a machine. A melody doesn't belong to any single note. It exists in the relationship between notes, unfolding over time. If one instrument drops out, the melody changes, but it doesn't necessarily vanish. Your brain may work in much the same way. Each hemisphere is capable of perceiving the world, forming intentions, remembering experiences, and responding emotionally. Under normal conditions, they are bound together by a thick bundle of neural connections that constantly share information. This connection acts like a translator and a peacemaker, smoothing out disagreements before they ever reach your awareness. As a result, your inner life feels singular, one stream of thought, one point of view, one self. Yet beneath that smooth surface, there may be more than one voice quietly contributing. This realization doesn't mean that you're divided or broken. In fact, it may be precisely the opposite. Having multiple systems working in parallel allows for flexibility, creativity, and resilience. It gives the brain the ability to compare options, weigh emotions against logic, and simulate different possibilities before settling on a path forward. You've likely felt this internal dialogue yourself. One part of you wants to stay in bed. Another insists it's time to get up. One part urges caution. Another leans toward curiosity. We often talk about these moments as if they were metaphors, figures of speech. But what if they are also descriptions, soft, imperfect descriptions of real processes happening inside the brain? The idea that consciousness might not be a single spotlight, but rather the result of overlapping contributions can feel unsettling at first. We like to believe there is a clear centre, a command post where decisions are made and meaning is assigned. But nature doesn't always build systems around a single point of control. More often, it relies on balance, feedback, and quiet negotiation. As we continue this journey, we'll see how accidents, surgeries, and careful experiments revealed what happens when that negotiation is interrupted. We'll meet people whose brains forced scientists to reconsider what the self really is, and slowly, without rushing, we'll begin to see how the feeling of being one person might emerge from something more subtle and more beautiful than a single voice in the dark. For now, let that idea rest lightly. Two halves, one head, and a question that doesn't demand an immediate answer. For most of human history, the idea of the mind felt simple in one important way. You had one body, therefore you must have had one mind. Thoughts might be confusing, emotions might clash, but underneath it all there was assumed to be a single inner owner, a single presence looking out through your eyes and steering the body forward through the world. This idea felt so natural that it was rarely questioned. If you close your eyes right now, you don't feel like a crowd. You feel like one observer, one stream of awareness, one place where experience happens. And yet, as science slowly began to look more carefully at the brain itself, that comforting simplicity started to feel less certain. Long before anyone could scan a living brain or measure its electrical activity, philosophers debated whether the mind was something separate from the body. Many believed it had to be. After all, thoughts had no weight, no colour, no obvious location. They didn't bleed when the body was injured. They didn't leave scars. It was tempting to imagine the mind as a guest inside the brain, rather than something built by it. But as medicine advanced, this idea began to quietly erode. Doctors noticed that injuries to certain parts of the head could reliably change specific aspects of behaviour. Not intelligence in a vague sense, but particular abilities, planning, self-control, speech, emotional balance. It was as if pieces of the mind could be nudged, dulled, or altered by physical damage. This did not fit comfortably with the idea of a single, indivisible mental core. Still, even with these clues, most people assumed that whatever consciousness was, it must ultimately be unified. Perhaps damaged, perhaps distorted, but still one thing. The brain itself, however, was telling a more complicated story. Anatomically, the two hemispheres are separated by a deep groove running from front to back. They are not fused into a single mass, they are paired, and although they are connected by millions of nerve fibres, those fibres are in a sense, bridges. And bridges imply two sides. Under normal circumstances, these bridges work so smoothly that the separation feels invisible. Information flows back and forth constantly. Visual input, bodily sensations, memories, emotional tone and language are shared and blended so quickly that the final experience feels seamless. You don't notice which half did what, you only notice the result. But seamless does not necessarily mean singular. To understand why this matters, imagine watching a play from the audience. You see a single story unfolding on stage, the actors move in coordination, the dialogue makes sense, but behind the scenes, there are separate lighting crews, sound technicians, stage managers, and directors, each with their own tasks and priorities. The unity of the performance is real, but it emerges from cooperation, not from a single pair of hands doing everything. The brain may operate in much the same way. Each hemisphere receives sensory information. Each can recognize patterns. Each can guide actions. And under the right conditions, each can even form intentions. The reason you usually experience one mind is not because there is only one capable system, but because the systems are constantly synchronized. This leads to a subtle but powerful shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "Where is consciousness located?" we might ask, "How is consciousness coordinated?" Coordination implies timing. It implies negotiation. It implies that different processes must reach some kind of agreement before an experience feels whole. This also helps explain why inner conflict feels so familiar. When you hesitate before making a decision, it can feel like two forces pulling in opposite directions. We usually describe this emotionally: desire versus responsibility, fear versus curiosity, comfort versus change. But beneath those feelings may be something more literal. Different systems in the brain evaluating the same situation in different ways. One system may focus on immediate safety. Another may simulate long-term outcomes. One may respond to emotional memory. Another may apply learned rules. None of these systems are wrong. They are simply doing what they evolved to do. The sense of a single I arises when these systems line up closely enough that their differences blur. When they don't, we feel tension, doubt, second thoughts. At this stage of the journey, it's important not to jump to dramatic conclusions. The idea that the brain contains multiple contributing systems does not mean you are secretly two people. It does not mean your identity is fragile or false. In fact, it may mean the opposite. It may mean that what you call yourself is remarkably resilient, able to emerge again and again from cooperation among many parts. The mystery, then, is not whether there are multiple processes at work. That much is clear. The mystery is how those processes create the smooth, continuous feeling of being someone, moment after moment, even as the underlying machinery remains complex and divided. As we move forward, we'll begin to see what happens when that coordination is disrupted, not gradually, but suddenly. When the quiet bridges between hemispheres are altered, when the stage crew stops sharing notes, and when the unity of the performance begins to crack just enough for us to glimpse what was always happening behind the scenes. For the moment, you can simply allow this idea to rest. Consciousness may not be a single, light shining from one place, but a carefully balanced glow formed by many sources, aligned just well enough to feel like one. And in that balance, the familiar sense of me quietly takes shape. There is a moment in the history of neuroscience that feels less like an experiment and more like a quiet rupture in how humanity understood itself. It did not happen in a laboratory filled with machines and blinking lights. It happened outdoors, on a dusty construction site, on an ordinary day that was supposed to end like any other. In the middle of the 19th century, a young railway foreman named Phineas Gage was supervising routine blasting work. The task was simple and familiar. Powder was packed, a fuse was set, and then, through a rare and catastrophic accident, an explosion sent a long iron rod upward, passing through his head and landing far behind him. By every expectation of the time, Gage should not have survived. Yet he did. He remained conscious. He could speak. He recognized people around him. He walked, talked, and eventually returned home. From the outside, it seemed like a miracle. But slowly, something unsettling became clear. Those who knew Gage best began to say a strange thing. They said he was no longer himself. Before the accident, he'd been described as responsible, friendly, and capable of planning complex tasks. Afterward, although his intelligence remained largely intact, his behavior changed. He became impulsive, irritable, unable to follow through on plans. He spoke without restraint. He acted without foresight. It was not that his memory was erased, or that he forgot how to speak, or that he lost awareness of the world around him. Something subtler had shifted. The part of him that weighed consequences, that quietly checked impulses before turning them into actions, seemed diminished. At the time, this was deeply disturbing. The dominant view held that the mind and the body were separate in some fundamental way. The soul, many believed, governed personality and moral character, while the brain merely carried out instructions. But Gage's injury challenged this comforting division. A piece of metal had passed through a specific region of his brain, and the result was a specific change in who he was. This forced a difficult question into the open. If personality can be altered by physical damage, then perhaps personality is not something floating above the brain at all. Perhaps it is woven into the brain's structure, quietly maintained by regions that operate so smoothly we never notice them, until they are gone. Later examinations of Gage's skull revealed that the damage had passed through the frontal regions of the brain, areas now known to be deeply involved in planning, decision-making, and regulating behavior over time. These regions help you pause. They help you imagine outcomes before acting. They help you hold competing possibilities in mind and choose the one that best aligns with your goals. When these regions are compromised, the world becomes immediate again. The present moment dominates. Impulses speak louder than long-term plans. What makes this story especially relevant to our exploration is not just that it links brain tissue to behavior, but that it hints at something more fragmented beneath the surface of the self. Phineas Gage did not lose consciousness. He did not lose awareness. But the balance between different parts of his mental life shifted. Some systems continued to function, others lost influence. The result was not the disappearance of a mind, but a reorganization of it. This suggests that what we experience as a unified self may depend on ongoing cooperation between multiple systems, each contributing something essential. When one system falters, the harmony changes. Imagine a group of musicians playing together. If the violin section grows quiet, the music does not stop. But it changes. The melody may still be there, but the tone is altered. The emotional balance shifts. In Gage's case, the instruments responsible for restraint and foresight were damaged. The remaining systems played on, but without the same moderation. For the first time, scientists began to seriously consider the idea that the mind might not be a single, indivisible entity. Instead, it might be more like a coalition, a temporary agreement between specialized processes that together create the experience of being someone. This realization was unsettling, but also illuminating. It suggested that the self is not located in one spot, like a jewel hidden in the brain. It is distributed. It emerges from relationships between regions, and it can change when those relationships are altered. Gage's story does not tell us everything. It does not explain consciousness by itself. But it cracks open a door. It shows that who we are depends on physical systems working together in delicate balance. And it prepares us for an even more surprising discovery, that different parts of the brain can not only shape behaviour, but also hold information independently, sometimes without sharing it at all. As we continue, we'll move from dramatic accidents to quieter observations, where speech, understanding and awareness begin to separate in ways that further challenge the idea of a single centralised mind. For now, let Phineas Gage's story linger gently, not as a tragedy, but as a turning point, a moment when science began to see the self not as a solid core, but as a living pattern sustained by cooperation and vulnerable to change. After the story of Phineas Gage quietly unsettled the idea of a single, indivisible self, another discovery followed that was far less dramatic on the surface, yet just as profound in what it revealed. There were no explosions this time, no iron rods, just a man sitting calmly, fully aware of the world around him, yet trapped in a strange silence of his own making. In the middle of the 19th century, a physician named Pierre-Paul Broca encountered a patient whose condition puzzled everyone who met him. The man appeared alert. He followed conversations. He understood questions. He reacted appropriately to what was said to him. But when he tried to speak, almost nothing came out. Again and again he produced the same single sound. Not a sentence, not even a word, just a fragment of language, repeated like a broken note on an instrument that refused to play the melody. At first it was tempting to assume that the man's intelligence was impaired, that perhaps he did not truly understand what was being said to him. But careful observation revealed something extraordinary. He understood everything. He simply could not translate that understanding into speech. This distinction may sound subtle, but it was revolutionary. For the first time, scientists were forced to confront the idea that comprehension and expression were not the same thing. That knowing what you want to say and being able to say it are handled by different systems. That a thought can exist fully formed, yet remain locked away, unable to reach the outside world. When the patient eventually passed away, Broca examined his brain and found damage in a specific region on the left side, an area now closely associated with speech production. The rest of the brain appeared relatively intact. This finding echoed something that had already begun to emerge from cases like Phineas Gage. Mental abilities were not evenly spread throughout the brain. They were localized, specialized, and crucially, separable. Broca went on to document several similar cases, each reinforcing the same pattern. People could lose the ability to speak while retaining understanding. Others could speak fluently, but lose the ability to comprehend. Language, it turned out, was not a single faculty, but a network of cooperating parts. This matters deeply for our exploration of consciousness. If awareness were truly a single, unified thing, then damage to one part of the brain should affect it uniformly. But that wasn't what doctors were seeing. Instead, they saw selective losses. One ability vanished while others remained. One channel closed while others stayed open. It was as if the mind had rooms that could be locked independently. Imagine standing inside a house where the lights are on, the windows are open, and you can see the world clearly. But the door is jammed. You are present, you are aware, yet you cannot step outside. That is what Broca's patients experienced with language. Thought without voice, meaning without sound. This separation challenges a common assumption we carry without noticing it, that thinking and speaking are tightly bound. In daily life, they feel inseparable. Words seem to arise naturally from thoughts. But the brain tells a different story. The connection feels smooth because the systems are usually well coordinated, not because they are the same. The deeper implication is even more unsettling. If understanding can exist without expression, then consciousness does not depend on outward behaviour. A person may appear silent, unresponsive, or limited, while still experiencing a rich inner world. This realization would later influence how doctors think about coma patients, stroke survivors, and people with severe motor impairments. It also nudges us toward a more careful definition of consciousness itself. Consciousness is not what you can show. It is what you can experience, and that experience may be hidden. Broca's discoveries also reinforced the growing suspicion that the left and right sides of the brain were not simply mirrored copies. Language production was strongly tied to the left hemisphere. Damage there caused specific deficits that did not appear when similar damage occurred on the right. This asymmetry raised new questions. If one hemisphere could lose a critical function like speech while the other remained intact, what else might be divided between them? What other abilities might be distributed quietly and unevenly across the two halves? More importantly, if one hemisphere holds abilities that the other does not, could it also hold experiences that the other does not fully access? At this stage in the story, scientists were not yet ready to answer that question, but the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The mind was not a single organ, it was a collaboration. And collaboration, by definition, allows for partial independence. As we move forward, we'll see how electricity, applied carefully to the living brain, would illuminate these hidden divisions even further. We will see memories awakened without warning, sensations triggered without intention, and maps of the brain drawn not on paper, but on living experience itself. For now, let this quieter story rest alongside the more dramatic one that came before it. Phineas Gage showed that personality could change when specific regions are damaged. Broca's patients showed that understanding could survive without speech. Together they whisper the same message. The self is not a single voice speaking from a single place. It is a conversation between systems, some of which may continue even when others fall silent. After accidents and illnesses revealed how fragile certain abilities could be, a different kind of discovery began to unfold, one that did not rely on injury at all, but on careful observation during moments when the brain was awake, exposed, and still thinking. In the early 20th century, a neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield performed operations on patients with severe epilepsy. These surgeries required the patient to remain conscious, because the brain itself does not feel pain in the way skin or muscle does. While the skull was open and the patient lay quietly, Penfield would gently stimulate small areas of the brain with a tiny electrical probe. What happened next was something no one had expected. When Penfield touched certain regions, a patient's hand would move. When he touched another spot, a foot might twitch. These responses were not vague or random. They were precise, reliable. Each area of the brain seemed linked to a specific part of the body, almost like keys on a piano, each one producing its own predictable note. Over time, Penfield began to draw maps, not abstract diagrams, but living maps based on real reactions. Touch here, the arm moves. Touch there, the lips twitch. The brain, it seemed, was organized not as a single control center, but as a carefully arranged landscape. Then something even stranger happened. When Penfield stimulated parts of the temporal lobe, some patients did not move at all. Instead, they spoke. They described sounds, voices, scenes from long ago. A woman suddenly heard music she recognized from childhood. A man described standing at the door of his school, hearing his mother's voice as clearly as if she were beside him. These were not memories recalled deliberately. The patients were not trying to remember. The memories arrived fully formed, vivid, and immersive, as if a hidden recording had been played back without warning. Penfield was stunned. He had not asked for memories. He had not suggested anything. He had simply touched a small patch of tissue, and an entire moment from the past came rushing back into awareness. This raised a profound question. If memories can be awakened by stimulating a specific region, then where are memories stored? Are they written down somewhere inside the brain, waiting quietly until the right key is pressed? Penfield believed that memories were not scattered loosely throughout the mind, nor were they actively reconstructed each time from scratch. Instead, he proposed that experiences leave lasting physical traces, not in the sense of tiny pictures stored in drawers, but as patterns of activity that can be reactivated. Think of it like grooves in a record. The music is not present until the needle touches the surface, but the structure that allows the music to appear is always there. This idea reshaped how scientists thought about memory. Memory was no longer just a story you told yourself. It was something your brain could replay, sometimes without your permission. But this discovery also carried a deeper implication for our understanding of consciousness. If a memory can be triggered without intention, then consciousness is not fully in charge of what appears in awareness. There are processes beneath the surface that decide what rises into the spotlight and when. Consciousness, rather than being the author of experience, may be more like the audience, watching events unfold that it did not consciously arrange. This challenges a comforting assumption. We often feel as though we choose what to remember, when to remember it, and how it feels. But Penfield's patients showed that memory can surface independently, bypassing conscious control altogether. It also hinted at something important about unity. When a memory surfaced, it felt like my memory, even though it had been triggered mechanically. The experience was seamless. There was no sense of distance, no feeling that the memory belonged to some other part of the brain. It was simply there, fully integrated into the person's sense of self. This suggests that the feeling of ownership, the sense that an experience belongs to you, does not require conscious choice. It arises automatically when information enters awareness, regardless of how it got there. Once again, the idea of a single controlling center began to fade. The brain appeared to consist of many specialized systems, each capable of generating experiences. Consciousness emerged when those experiences were brought together into a shared space. Penfield's maps also reinforced the idea that the brain is not organized around meaning, but around function. There is no single region labeled memory or self. Instead, there are networks that contribute pieces to the larger picture. Some handle sensation, some handle movement, some handle emotion, some quietly store the past. When these networks work together, the result feels whole. When they are activated separately, their independence becomes visible. As we drift further into this story, it becomes increasingly difficult to hold on to the idea of consciousness as a single voice speaking from a single place. Instead, it begins to resemble a gathering, many participants contributing, sometimes in harmony, sometimes out of sync. Penfield did not set out to divide the mind. He was trying to relieve suffering, yet in the process he revealed something gentle and unsettling. That your memories, your movements, and even your sense of presence can be summoned from specific places without asking your permission. The self, it seems, is less like a commander issuing orders and more like a meeting point, where signals arrive, combine, and become experience. As we continue, we'll begin to step back and look at the brain as a whole, mapping not just isolated functions, but the broader architecture that allows all of this to feel like one continuous life. For now, let the image linger softly. A quiet room, a gentle touch, and a memory, waiting patiently until the moment it returns. By now, the brain has begun to feel less like a single room and more like a landscape. Accidents revealed that personality could change. Patients showed that understanding could exist without speech. Gentle electrical touches awakened memories long forgotten. Each discovery added another clue, suggesting that the mind is not housed in one place, but distributed across many. To make sense of this distribution, it helps to take a slow, unhurried walk through the brain itself, not as an anatomist with labels and measurements, but as a quiet observer, moving from neighbourhood to neighbourhood, noticing what each area tends to contribute. Imagine standing above a city at night. From a distance, the lights blur together into one glowing shape. But as you descend, patterns emerge. Residential streets, industrial zones, cultural centres. Each area has its own rhythm, its own role, and yet the city only functions because they all interact. The outer layer of the brain, often called the cerebral cortex, can be thought of as the city's surface. This is where much of what we associate with conscious experience takes place. It is folded and wrinkled, not to confuse us, but to fit a large surface area into a small space. More surface means more room for processing. At the front of this landscape lies the frontal region. This area is deeply involved in planning, restraint, and imagining what might happen next. When you pause before speaking, when you weigh options, when you consider consequences that have not yet arrived, this region is quietly active. It is less concerned with what is happening right now, and more with what could happen later. When this region works well, it feels almost invisible. You don't notice it when you choose not to interrupt someone or when you decide to save money instead of spending it impulsively. But when it is compromised, as we saw with Phineas Gage, the present moment can overwhelm the future. Impulses become louder, patience becomes harder. Moving upward and slightly back, we arrive at regions that help you understand where your body is in space. These areas process touch, position, and spatial relationships. They allow you to know where your hand is without looking at it. They help you navigate a room, judge distances, and coordinate movement. These systems work constantly in the background. When they function smoothly, you feel grounded and oriented. When they don't, strange things can happen. Some people with damage in these areas may neglect one side of their own body, not because they are blind, but because their brain no longer includes that side in its internal map. At the back of the brain lies the region devoted primarily to vision. Light enters the eyes, but sight itself is constructed here. Shapes, edges, movement, and colour are transformed into something meaningful. This process happens so effortlessly that it feels like vision is passive, as if the world simply appears. But in reality, the brain is working constantly to assemble what you see. If this area is damaged, the eyes may still function perfectly, yet the experience of seeing can be altered or lost. Once again, awareness proves to be a construction, not a direct feed. Along the sides of the brain, near the temples, lie regions deeply involved in recognizing faces, processing sound, and attaching emotional significance to experiences. These areas help you recognize familiar voices, detect tone, and remember what something felt like, not just what it was. Damage here can lead to a particularly unsettling experience, seeing a familiar face without feeling that it is familiar. The features are recognized, but the emotional tag is missing. The brain registers the shape, but not the meaning. As we move through these neighborhoods, one thing becomes clear. There is no obvious headquarters, no central office labeled self, no single region where everything comes together under one ruler. Instead, each area contributes a piece. Sensation here, memory there, emotion somewhere else, planning in another corner entirely. The sense of unity we experience does not come from a single place doing all the work. It comes from coordination, from timing, from information flowing between regions quickly enough that the seams remain hidden. This perspective changes how we think about consciousness. Rather than asking which part of the brain is conscious, it becomes more accurate to ask how these parts communicate. Consciousness may not be located in a neighborhood, but in the traffic between them. When traffic flows smoothly, the city feels alive and unified. When it slows, fragments appear. When bridges fail, divisions become visible. This also helps explain why the brain can feel different in different states. When you're tired, emotional, focused, or drifting towards sleep, different neighborhoods become more or less active. The city does not shut down. It rearranges its priorities. As you lie in bed at night, letting thoughts wander, some regions quiet down while others grow more active. Sensory processing fades. Internal reflection grows stronger. Memories and imagined futures begin to mingle. The balance shifts, and with it, the quality of experience. Seen this way, consciousness is not a thing you possess, but a pattern the brain enters, a way of organizing activity across many regions at once. This understanding prepares us for an even deeper insight. The brain is not only divided into functional neighborhoods, it is also layered with history. Beneath these modern districts lie older systems shaped by evolution, still active, still influential. And it is there, in those deeper layers, that we begin to see why the mind can feel ancient, emotional, and rational all at once. For now, let this mental walk come to a gentle pause. The city is still glowing, the neighborhoods are still talking, and somewhere in their quiet coordination, the feeling of being you continues to arise. As we continue to wander through the brain's landscape, something quietly remarkable begins to reveal itself. The brain is not only organized across space, with different neighborhoods handling different tasks. It is also organized across time, layered, historical. Like a museum that never closed, where ancient machinery still hums beneath modern exhibits. To understand this, imagine walking through a grand building where each floor belongs to a different era. The lowest levels are old and sturdy, built for survival. Higher floors are newer, more elaborate, designed for comfort, creativity, and planning. None of the older floors were removed when the newer ones were added. They were simply built on top of. Your brain developed in much the same way. Long before humans existed, long before language, long before planning for tomorrow, life faced a simpler challenge: survive the next moment. Early nervous systems evolved to react quickly, detect danger, seek warmth, find food. These systems did not need reflection or imagination, they needed speed. Deep inside the brain, many of these ancient systems are still active. They regulate breathing, heart rate, basic movement, and reflexes. They respond before you have time to think. When you pull your hand away from a hot surface, you're witnessing the work of neural pathways that evolved long before conscious thought became a priority. Above these older systems lie networks that emerged later, as animals began to live in more complex environments. These systems helped organisms remember locations, recognize others, and respond emotionally. Fear, attachment, aggression, curiosity. These feelings did not appear by accident. They are efficient ways of guiding behavior when survival depends on social interaction and learning from experience. These emotional systems are powerful. They color perception, they shape memory, they influence decisions, and they often operate faster than rational thought. When you feel a sudden sense of unease without knowing why, it may be because these older systems have detected a pattern that your conscious mind has not yet identified. Only much later in evolutionary history did the most recent layers of the brain expand dramatically. These are the regions associated with abstract thought, long-term planning, and imagining possibilities that do not yet exist. These systems allow you to ask questions like, what if, and what happens next? They enable you to replay the past and simulate the future. What makes the human brain unique is not the presence of these layers, but their scale and integration. We did not replace instinct with reason, we stacked them, and then we asked them to cooperate. This cooperation is not always smooth. Sometimes ancient instincts push in one direction, while newer planning systems pull in another. You may feel drawn toward immediate comfort while also knowing it conflicts with long-term goals. You may experience fear even when logic says you are safe. These moments are not flaws, they are negotiations between layers built at different times, for different purposes. Seen through this lens, inner conflict becomes something natural, even necessary. The older systems are excellent at responding to immediate threats and opportunities. They are fast, efficient, and emotionally compelling. The newer systems are better at imagining distant consequences, weighing complex options, and inhibiting impulsive actions. Together they form a brain capable of both survival and reflection. But because they evolved separately, they do not always agree. This layered structure helps explain why consciousness can feel fragmented without being broken. Different layers can dominate awareness at different times. When fear surges, older systems take the lead. When planning and reasoning prevail, newer systems guide behavior. The feeling of a single self emerges when these layers align closely enough to tell a coherent story, and when they do not, the story becomes tense. This evolutionary perspective also deepens our understanding of why the brain has two hemispheres. Each hemisphere contains its own layered systems. Each carries ancient instincts and modern planning machinery. Under normal conditions, these systems are synchronized across both sides, blending their contributions into a unified experience. But if synchronization falters, differences emerge. One hemisphere may emphasize emotional tone while the other leans toward language and explanation. One may react quickly while the other reflects. The result is not chaos, but complexity. The brain in this sense is not a single machine upgraded over time. It is a collection of machines from different eras, all running simultaneously. Consciousness arises not from the newest part alone, but from the ongoing conversation between old and new. This also helps explain why modern life can feel mentally exhausting. We ask ancient systems to handle situations they were never designed for. Social media triggers emotional responses meant for small groups. Financial stress activates survival circuits in an environment where threats are abstract and prolonged. The brain does its best, but the mismatch can create tension. As night approaches and the pace of the day slows, some of these systems begin to quiet. The demand for rapid response fades, sensory input softens, internal reflection grows louder. The balance shifts again, allowing different layers to speak more freely. In these quieter moments, thoughts drift, memories surface, imagined futures appear and dissolve. The brain, relieved of immediate demands, explores itself. Understanding the brain as an evolutionary museum allows us to be gentler with these experiences. Instead of seeing distraction, emotion, or inner conflict as failures, we can see them as echoes of a long history, still active, still participating. You're not fighting your brain. You're living inside a structure shaped by millions of years, doing its best to balance speed with foresight, instinct with imagination. As we move onward, this layered view will become essential. It will help us understand what happens when communication between hemispheres is altered, and why the feeling of being oneself can persist even when the underlying systems begin to act independently. For now, let the image rest gently a museum after hours, ancient exhibits humming softly, newer galleries glowing faintly above, and somewhere among them, a visitor moving quietly, aware without needing to control everything at once. Up to this point, every story we've explored has shared one quiet assumption. No matter how complex the brain's internal structure might be, no matter how many layers or neighborhoods it contains, the two halves of the brain are always talking to each other. Messages flow back and forth constantly, smoothing disagreements before they reach awareness. The feeling of being one person depends heavily on that conversation. But what happens when the conversation is interrupted? Not metaphorically, not gradually, but physically. Running between the left and right hemispheres is a thick bundle of nerve fibers, a structure that acts like a major highway. It carries information at astonishing speed, allowing the two sides of the brain to share sensations, intentions, and interpretations almost instantly. Most of the time, this bridge works so quietly that we forget it exists, until it doesn't. In the mid-20th century, surgeons faced a desperate problem. Some patients suffered from severe epilepsy, with seizures so intense and frequent that medication offered little relief. These seizures often began in one hemisphere and rapidly spread to the other, overwhelming the entire brain. Doctors realized that if they could prevent the seizure from crossing that bridge, they might protect the patient from the worst effects. The solution was drastic but precise. They surgically severed the main connection between the hemispheres. The operation worked, seizures were reduced, leaves improved, and then something unexpected emerged. At first, these patients appeared completely normal. They could speak, walk, work, and hold conversations. Nothing about their everyday behaviour suggested a divided mind. If anything, the brain seemed to adapt remarkably well. But when scientists began to test these patients carefully, asking questions in specific ways, a hidden division revealed itself. To understand what they discovered, imagine presenting information to just one side of the brain. Because each hemisphere processes information from the opposite side of the visual field, researchers could show an image to the left side of a person's vision, which sends information primarily to the right hemisphere. When they showed an object to the right hemisphere and asked the person to name it out loud, the person said they saw nothing. But if they asked the person to reach out and pick up the object, the correct hand moved effortlessly and selected it. The right hemisphere knew what it had seen. It simply could not speak. This was not confusion. It was separation. Each hemisphere was processing information independently, without sharing it across the severed bridge. One side could act on information that the other side could not access, and yet, to the person experiencing it, everything still felt normal until the experiment revealed otherwise. In some cases, the two hemispheres even seemed to want different things. One hand might begin to button a shirt while the other moved to unbutton it. One side of the brain initiated an action, while the other resisted. These moments were rare, but they were striking. They suggested that intention itself could be divided. This forced scientists to confront a deeply uncomfortable idea. If one hemisphere can perceive, decide, and act without the other's knowledge, then perhaps each hemisphere can host its own stream of awareness. Not a second personality, not a second voice speaking out loud, but a parallel experience, running quietly alongside the one you usually identify with. Roger Sperry, one of the key figures in this research, argued that each hemisphere possessed its own conscious system. Under normal conditions, these systems are tightly integrated, they function as one. But when integration is removed, their independence becomes visible. What makes this even more unsettling is how calm it all appears from the inside. Patients did not feel fractured. They did not feel like two people trapped in one body. The unity of experience persisted because the dominant hemisphere, usually the one responsible for language, continued to construct a coherent narrative. The other hemisphere acted, perceived, and responded, but without a voice. This reveals something profound about consciousness. The feeling of unity may not require full access to all mental processes. It may only require a convincing story. If one system is skilled at explanation and interpretation, it can maintain the illusion of a single self, even when other systems are operating independently. This also helps explain why the split brain phenomenon went unnoticed for so long. Without careful testing, the divisions remain hidden. Everyday life does not demand perfect internal agreement. Most actions are simple enough that one hemisphere's contribution is sufficient. It is only under specific conditions, when information is deliberately isolated, that the separation becomes clear. These findings do not mean that we are secretly divided in daily life. They mean that unity is an achievement, not a given. It is something the brain actively maintains through communication and coordination. When that coordination is disrupted, the underlying structure becomes visible. As we continue, we will look more closely at how the brain restores unity, even in the face of missing information. We will meet the system that steps in to explain, rationalize, and smooth over gaps. Often without caring whether the explanation is true, only that it is plausible. For now, it helps to notice rather than explain. A bridge once busy with traffic, now quiet. Two sides still alive, still thinking, still acting, and a single story continuing, almost effortlessly, above it all. Once the bridge between the hemispheres had been cut, scientists realized that something extraordinary was now possible. For the first time, they could observe what each half of the brain might do on its own, without quietly blending its intentions with the other. What they discovered was not chaos, but something far more unsettling: calm disagreement. In carefully designed experiments, split-brain patients were asked to perform simple tasks. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would feel strange in daily life. And yet, under the surface, the brain revealed a quiet duality that had always been there, hidden by cooperation. Imagine sitting at a table with objects placed in front of you. You're asked to look at them, reach for one, and describe what you chose. Under normal circumstances, this feels effortless. You see, you decide, you act, and you explain, all in one smooth flow. But in split-brain patients, this flow could be gently interrupted. When an object was shown only to the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere, the one most responsible for speech, often reported seeing nothing at all. There was no hesitation, no sense of confusion, just an honest absence. And yet, when the patient was asked to reach out with the left hand, which is primarily guided by the right hemisphere, the hand moved with confidence. It grasped the correct object without error. From the outside, this looked like a contradiction. How could someone pick up an object they claimed not to see? From the inside, however, there was no contradiction at all. Each hemisphere was doing exactly what it was capable of doing. One perceived and acted, the other narrated. In some cases, this separation led to moments that felt almost playful. A patient might laugh when one hand acted in a way they could not explain, not because they felt controlled, but because the behaviour seemed to arrive from nowhere. More striking were the moments of genuine conflict. There were reports of one hand reaching to open a door, while the other moved to close it. One hand selecting clothing, the other undoing the choice moments later. These were not seizures or reflexes. They were goal-directed actions, initiated by different hemispheres. The body, it seemed, had become a shared space. It is tempting to imagine these moments as dramatic, as if two personalities were fighting for control. But that is not how patients describe the experience. Most of the time, the disagreement felt subtle, brief, almost like a hesitation amplified just enough to be seen. What makes these observations so important is not their strangeness, but their implication. They suggest that intention itself is not singular. Each hemisphere can generate goals, preferences, and actions. Under normal conditions, these intentions are aligned quickly enough that we experience them as one. When alignment is removed, the independence becomes visible. This forces us to rethink what it means to decide something. When you reach for a glass of water, who decided to do that? Was it a single command issued from a central self? Or was it the outcome of multiple systems agreeing almost instantly on a course of action? Split-brain research suggests the latter. The feeling of choice may arise after the action has already been selected as part of the brain's effort to make sense of what just happened. Conscious awareness, rather than initiating every move, may often be explaining it. This does not mean that consciousness is useless or illusory. It means that its role may be different from what we intuitively assume. Instead of being the engine, it may be the narrator. Instead of steering, it may be interpreting. In split-brain patients, the narrator continues to speak, even when it lacks crucial information. When asked why a hand performed a certain action, patients often gave confident explanations, even when those explanations were clearly invented. This was not dishonesty. It was the brain doing what it does best, creating coherence. The mind abhors gaps. When information is missing, it fills them in. It builds a story that makes sense of the available pieces. Accuracy is optional. Consistency is not. These moments reveal something deeply human. We are not always aware of why we do what we do. We often discover our reasons after the fact. The sense of agency, the feeling that I chose this, may emerge slightly later than the choice itself. In everyday life, this delay is invisible. The systems involved operate quickly enough that cause and explanation feel simultaneous. But in split-brain conditions, the delay becomes long enough to notice, and with that delay, the illusion of a single deciding self begins to soften. What remains is not emptiness, but complexity. Two hemispheres, multiple layers, many systems, each contributing something. Consciousness in this view is not a command center issuing orders, but a meeting place where actions are noticed, interpreted, and woven into a story that feels continuous. This story is powerful, it is persuasive, it gives us a sense of identity and responsibility, but it may not always reflect the full machinery beneath it. As we move deeper, we'll look more closely at this storyteller, the part of the brain that insists on making sense of everything, even when it doesn't have all the facts. This system will help us understand not only split-brain behavior, but everyday reasoning, rationalization, and the quiet confidence with which we explain ourselves. For now, let this image settle gently. Two hands, one body, each guided by its own silent intentions, and a single voice, calmly explaining it all after the fact. By the time scientists reached this point in their observations, the question was no longer whether the brain could behave as if it were divided. That much was undeniable. The deeper question now hovered quietly beneath every experiment and every careful report. If each hemisphere can perceive, decide, and act on its own, does that mean there are truly two consciousnesses living inside one skull? This is not a question that invites a quick answer. It resists simple labels, and yet the evidence from split-brain research gently but persistently pushes us toward a more nuanced view of awareness. When Roger Sperry and his colleagues studied split-brain patients, they were careful not to dramatize their findings. They did not claim that two personalities had been unleashed, or that a hidden twin had been discovered inside the head. Instead, they spoke of independent systems of consciousness, parallel streams of experience that normally operate in close coordination. Each hemisphere, they argued, possesses the essential ingredients of awareness. It can receive sensory input, it can respond meaningfully, it can form intentions, and crucially, it can learn from experience. The difference lies not in capability, but in expression. The left hemisphere in most people has direct access to language. It can name objects, describe feelings, and explain actions. When asked what is happening, it answers confidently. The right hemisphere, by contrast, often lacks the ability to speak. But silence does not imply emptiness. It perceives, evaluates, and responds in its own way through action rather than words. This asymmetry creates a powerful illusion. Because only one hemisphere can usually tell its story, it feels as though there is only one storyteller. The other stream of awareness remains quiet, its presence inferred only through behaviour. In split-brain patients, this imbalance becomes visible. The speaking hemisphere continues to narrate experience, unaware that another perspective is unfolding alongside it. Meanwhile, the silent hemisphere perceives a world that never fully enters the shared narrative. This leads to an unsettling but illuminating insight. Consciousness may not be defined by speech, reflection, or explanation. It may exist wherever there is experience, even if that experience never becomes part of a verbal story. To appreciate this, imagine watching a movie with the sound turned off. The images are still meaningful. The story still unfolds. You understand what is happening, even without dialogue. Now imagine watching the same movie with the sound on but the screen dark. You hear voices, music, and emotion but lack visual context. Each version offers a complete experience in its own way, yet each misses something the other has. The two hemispheres may operate in a similar fashion. Each constructs a version of the world based on the information it receives and the tools it has available. Under normal conditions, these versions are blended seamlessly. Under split-brain conditions, they diverge. What makes this divergence so striking is how calm it feels. There's no internal alarm announcing the division, no sense of fracture. Each hemisphere simply continues doing what it has always done, unaware that its partner is no longer fully in sync. This suggests that the feeling of unity we associate with consciousness does not require full integration. It requires continuity. As long as one stream of experience flows smoothly and consistently, it feels whole. This challenges a deeply held intuition that consciousness must be singular to be real. Split-brain research suggests instead that consciousness can be multiple without feeling fragmented, as long as each stream remains internally coherent. In everyday life, this multiplicity is hidden by speed. Information crosses the hemispheric bridge so quickly that differences are resolved before they reach awareness. The brain edits itself in real time, presenting a polished version of experience. But when editing is removed, the raw structure becomes visible. This also reframes how we think about the self. Rather than being a single entity residing somewhere in the brain, the self may be an emergent agreement, a temporary alignment between systems that share information, goals, and interpretations. When alignment is strong, the self feels solid. When alignment weakens, cracks appear. Not as madness, but as subtle tension. You may recognize this tension in everyday moments, wanting to say something but holding back, feeling drawn toward an action while also resisting it, laughing at a joke before realizing you shouldn't. These are not failures of will, they are signs of multiple systems contributing simultaneously. Split-brain patients simply reveal this process in a more visible form. Importantly, Sperry did not argue that one hemisphere was more real than the other. Both mattered. Both experienced. Both responded to the world in meaningful ways. The difference was that one could explain itself and the other could not. This raises a final, gently unsettling thought. If the part of the brain that speaks is not the only part that experiences, then our verbal self, the voice in our head, may not be the whole story. It may be a spokesperson, not the entire organisation. And yet, this does not diminish the value of that voice. Narration brings coherence. It allows memory to be shared, plans to be formed, and responsibility to be assigned. Without it, experience would remain scattered. Consciousness, then, may not be about having a single ruler inside the mind. It may be about maintaining enough coordination that many voices can function as one. As we move onward, we will examine the system that performs this coordination most insistently, the interpreter that steps in to explain actions, smooth contradictions, and preserve the feeling of unity even when information is missing. For now, let this idea settle quietly. Two streams of awareness, flowing side by side, usually merged, sometimes separate, and always working together to create the simple, convincing feeling of being one. Up to this point, the brain has revealed itself as layered, divided, and quietly collaborative. We have seen how two hemispheres can perceive differently, decide independently, and even disagree. And yet, despite all of this complexity, despite the many voices, layers, and parallel processes, your inner life usually feels simple, continuous, singular. You don't feel like a committee. You feel like one person. This raises a gentle but essential question. If the brain is so distributed, so full of separate contributors, why does experience feel unified? Why does it feel like there is one clear me at the centre of it all? Part of the answer lies in a quiet mental habit so familiar that we rarely notice it: storytelling. Michael Gazzaniga, one of the leading figures in split brain research, proposed that the left hemisphere plays a special role in this process. He described a system he called the interpreter, not a controller, not a decision maker, but something closer to a narrator. The interpreter's job is not to make things happen. Its job is to explain what just happened. Whenever an action occurs, a thought appears, or an emotion rises, the interpreter steps in and asks silently, "Why did that happen?" And then, almost instantly, it offers an answer. The remarkable thing is that the interpreter does not require complete information. It works with whatever pieces it has. If the full picture is available, it uses it. If not, it fills in the gaps. Accuracy is optional, coherence is not. This tendency became especially clear in split-brain experiments. In one famous setup, different information was presented to each hemisphere. The right hemisphere might see an image, while the left hemisphere, the one that can speak, remained unaware of it. When the person's body responded to the unseen image, the speaking hemisphere was asked to explain the behaviour, and it did, confidently, smoothly, without hesitation. The explanation often had nothing to do with the real cause, but it sounded reasonable, plausible, complete. In one variation of this experiment, a simple instruction was given to the right hemisphere. Perform a small action. The person stood up or reached for an object. When asked why they had done so, the left hemisphere did not say, "I don't know." Instead, it invented a reason. "I needed to stretch. I wanted to get a drink. I felt uncomfortable sitting." None of these were lies, they were stories. Stories designed to preserve the feeling that behaviour flows from intention, and intention flows from a single self. Another gentle example, often retold, involves a simple object, a banana. The right hemisphere is given a visual cue related to the banana, while the left hemisphere remains unaware. When the person reaches for it, the interpreter steps in to explain the action, confidently constructing a reason that fits everyday logic. The key insight here is not that the brain deceives us, it is that the brain prefers meaning to mystery. Silence is uncomfortable, gaps feel threatening. When something happens without a clear cause, the interpreter rushes to restore order by weaving a narrative. This habit is not limited to split-brain patients. It happens to all of us, all the time. You decide to take a different route home, and only afterward realize you were avoiding a difficult conversation. You feel irritated and then search for a reason. You make a choice quickly and later build an explanation that makes it feel thoughtful. In each case, the interpreter is doing its quiet work. This storytelling does something crucial. It creates continuity. It takes scattered events and binds them into a single thread. Without it, experience would feel disjointed, actions without reasons, emotions without context. The interpreter gives us a self we can recognize, but it comes with a subtle cost. Because the interpreter speaks so confidently, we often mistake explanation for cause. We assume that because we can tell a story about why we did something, that story must be the origin of the action. Split-brain research gently challenges this assumption. It suggests that many actions are initiated elsewhere, by emotional systems, perceptual processes, or unconscious evaluations, and only later claimed by the narrator. This does not mean the self is an illusion. It means the self is a construction, a carefully maintained one. Think of the interpreter as a calm voice in a dark room, describing shapes as they pass by. The shapes are real, the voice is real, but the voice is not creating the shapes. It is making them intelligible. This distinction matters as we continue, because once we understand that the feeling of unity is maintained by explanation rather than control, we can begin to see consciousness not as a single command center, but as a shared space where many processes report in. The interpreter does not silence other voices. It translates their outcomes into a story that feels personal and consistent. This is why, even when the brain is divided, even when information is missing, experience still feels whole. The narrator is very good at its job. As we move forward, this idea will expand. We will look beyond a single interpreter and begin to see consciousness itself as a conversation. Many contributors speaking softly, with only one voice at a time reaching the microphone. For now, let this image rest. A storyteller sitting quietly inside the mind, filling the pauses, smoothing the rough edges, and ensuring that no matter how complex the machinery beneath, life continues to feel like one ongoing tale. Once you begin to see the mind as a place where stories are told rather than commands issued, another quiet shift follows. Consciousness no longer feels like a single voice speaking from a throne. It begins to feel more like a conversation already in progress. Many participants speaking softly, overlapping slightly, with only one voice clearly heard at any given moment. Most of the time, you are aware of only one thought, one image, one feeling. It feels as if your mind shines a single spotlight, illuminating one part of experience while everything else fades into the background. This is why consciousness feels narrow and focused, even though the brain itself is busy with countless processes at once. But this spotlight is not a ruler. It does not command the rest of the mind into silence. It simply highlights one contribution among many. Beneath the surface, the brain is constantly evaluating possibilities. Sensory systems register sights and sounds. Emotional systems assess relevance and risk. Memory systems retrieve related experiences. Planning systems simulate outcomes. Each of these processes generates its own quiet suggestions about what should matter next. Most of these suggestions never reach awareness. They compete gently, and the one that best fits the moment, based on relevance, urgency, and emotional weight, wins access to the spotlight. This competition happens continuously, and it happens quickly. By the time you notice a thought, the contest has already been resolved. This helps explain something you may have experienced many times. A thought seems to appear out of nowhere. A memory surfaces unexpectedly. An idea interrupts another. These moments do not feel chosen, they feel received. Consciousness in this view is less like a general issuing orders and more like a town hall where proposals are presented. Only one proposal is heard at a time, but many are always waiting in the wings. When the brain is calm, these transitions feel smooth. When the brain is stressed, tired, or emotionally charged, the competition becomes noisier. Thoughts interrupt each other more often, attention drifts, the spotlight jumps. This does not mean something is wrong. It means the system is busy. What creates the feeling that a thought is yours is not its origin, but its arrival. The moment a thought enters awareness, it is immediately tagged as personal. Ownership is automatic. You do not need to approve the thought or trace its source. It simply appears, already labelled as mine. This automatic ownership is one of the most powerful illusions the brain creates, and one of the most useful. Without it, experience would feel disjointed. Thoughts would appear as strangers. Feelings would feel foreign. Action would feel disconnected from intention. The sense of a continuous self depends on this immediate sense of ownership, even when the underlying process is distributed. This perspective also reframes attention. We often imagine attention as something we direct, like pointing a flashlight, but much of the time attention is pulled rather than pushed. Something becomes emotionally relevant, surprising, or meaningful, and the spotlight moves there on its own. You may plan to focus on one thing, only to find your attention drifting elsewhere. This is not a failure of will, it is the result of competing processes making different arguments about what matters most. In this way, consciousness resembles a quiet election. Many candidates are always present, only one is elected at a time. The election is ongoing, fluid, and sensitive to context. No single system permanently holds power. This model helps explain why the interpreter we go, but as preference. A molecule that could replicate itself more effectively would persist longer. A structure that responded differently to heat, light, or chemical gradients would last longer than one that did not. Over countless cycles, these tiny differences mattered. There was no awareness, no intention, but there was selection. Seen this way, the roots of choice do not begin with thought, they begin with sensitivity, with systems that react differently depending on circumstances. A basic this rather than that. As life grew more complex, these sensitivities became organized. Simple feedback relationships emerged. When conditions were favorable, certain reactions were reinforced. When conditions were harmful, they were suppressed. Over time, these patterns grew layered and refined. Imagine a thermostat in a quiet room. It does not think, it does not feel, but it senses temperature and responds. If the room cools, it turns on heat. If the room warms, it turns off. This is not intelligence, but it is regulation, a loop that monitors and adjusts. Early life forms were filled with such loops. They sensed their internal state and the surrounding environment, adjusting behavior in ways that promoted stability. As organisms became more complex, these loops began to interact. Sensing expanded beyond temperature to include chemical signals, pressure, light, and movement. Responses became more varied. Some reactions were faster, others were slower but more flexible. At no point did consciousness suddenly switch on. There was no moment when life crossed a clear line from unconscious to conscious. Instead, there was a gradual accumulation of modelling. A system that can sense its environment is already building a simple model of it. A system that can remember past conditions is building a richer one. A system that can predict outcomes based on past experience is building something even more powerful. By the time nervous systems emerged, this layered modelling had already been underway for a very long time. Neurons did not invent choice. They refined it. They allowed information to travel faster, to integrate across larger distances, and to coordinate responses across the entire organism. Feedback loops that once operated locally could now influence behaviour globally. This is where the early foundations of consciousness begin to resemble what we experience today, not as a sudden emergence of awareness, but as a gradual expansion of internal modelling. An organism that can model its environment can respond more flexibly. An organism that can model itself can regulate internal states more effectively. An organism that can model both at once can begin to coordinate complex behaviour. At each step, the system becomes less reactive and more anticipatory. This anticipation is crucial. It marks the shift from responding only to what is happening now, to preparing for what might happen next. You can think of this as the difference between flinching and planning. Both are responses. But one happens after the fact, while the other unfolds in advance. As brains evolved, they became increasingly skilled at running internal simulations. These simulations did not require language. They did not require awareness in the human sense. They were simply internal predictions, guiding behaviour toward outcomes that had worked before. Over time, these simulations grew richer. They incorporated memory, emotion, and eventually imagination. They allowed organisms not only to respond, but to evaluate options before acting. Consciousness, in this view, is not the source of choice. It is the space where these simulations become visible. By the time a system can reflect on its own predictions, compare multiple possibilities, and feel the weight of different outcomes, awareness has already emerged naturally from the architecture beneath it. This perspective gently dissolves the idea that consciousness must be special or separate. It does not diminish it, it grounds it. Your ability to choose, to hesitate, to imagine alternatives rests on foundations laid long before you were born, long before humans existed, long before brains had names for themselves. And yet something remarkable happens when these ancient processes reach a certain level of complexity. The system begins to notice itself. It begins to experience its own modelling. That experience is what we call consciousness. As we move forward, we will look more closely at the structure of these feedback systems, how simple loops become complex models, and how relationships between processes give rise to the feeling of awareness itself. For now, let this long view settle gently. Life responding, life adapting, life gradually learning to anticipate rather than react, and from that slow unfolding, the quiet emergence of experience. If we follow the story of consciousness far enough back, we eventually arrive at a quiet but powerful idea. Awareness is not a thing that suddenly appears. It is a pattern that slowly takes shape, and the threads that weave this pattern together are feedback loops. The phrase itself can sound technical, even mechanical, but the idea behind it is surprisingly gentle. A feedback loop is simply a system that listens to itself. It acts, senses the result of that action, and adjusts what it does next. Over time, this listening creates stability, flexibility, and eventually something that looks a lot like understanding. You experience feedback loops constantly, even if you never notice them. When you speak and hear your own voice, you adjust your volume without thinking. When you walk on uneven ground, your body subtly shifts balance from step to step. These adjustments happen automatically, guided by information flowing back into the system. Now imagine this process growing richer. The earliest feedback loops in living systems were simple. They regulated internal conditions, keeping temperature, chemistry, and energy levels, removes the need for mystery without removing wonder. Consciousness does not require a magical ingredient added at the last moment. It requires complexity, coordination, and time. When enough loops listen to one another, when information circulates richly enough, experience arises naturally. This also means that consciousness is not all or nothing. It exists in degrees. Simpler systems have simpler forms of awareness. Richer systems have richer ones. There is no sharp boundary where experience begins. There is only a gradual increase in depth. This idea aligns beautifully with what we have already seen. Split brains do not destroy consciousness. They divide the loops. The interpreter does not create experience, it narrates it. Competing processes do not eliminate unity, they negotiate it. Feedback is the quiet thread running through all of these observations. As we move closer to the present moment, to human thought and imagination, we will see how one particular expansion of feedback changes everything. When a system becomes capable of modeling not just the present, but the future, awareness takes on a new dimension. For now, let this image rest. Loops listening to loops, reflections reflecting reflections, and from their endless conversation, the gentle shape of awareness forming, not suddenly, not mysteriously, but patiently over time. Among all the patterns that feedback loops can create, there is one that changes the texture of experience more than any other. It is the ability to step away from the present moment without moving at all, to remain physically still while the mind walks ahead. This ability is so familiar that it often goes unnoticed. You sit quietly, yet you imagine tomorrow's conversation. You replay yesterday's mistake. You picture a version of yourself that has not yet arrived. In these moments, you are not reacting to what is happening. You're visiting what might happen. This is where human consciousness takes on its most distinctive shape. Many animals can learn from the past, some can anticipate simple outcomes, but humans live inside extended timelines. We do not merely respond to the present, we inhabit the future. This capacity rests largely on regions at the front of the brain that are especially good at simulation. Rather than issuing commands, these regions build internal scenes. They combine memory, emotion, and prediction into imagined possibilities. When you plan, you're not calculating in a cold, mechanical way. You're running a story. You imagine yourself speaking. You imagine how someone else might respond. You imagine how you might feel afterward. These imagined futures are not abstract. They carry emotional weight. They can produce excitement, fear, hope, or regret before anything has actually happened. This is why thinking about the future can feel exhausting. It is not light mental work. It is experiential. The brain does not simply mark time on a calendar. It builds small worlds and temporarily steps inside them. From the perspective of feedback loops, this represents a major expansion. Earlier systems responded to what was happening. Later systems responded to patterns that had already occurred. But these newer loops respond to events that exist only as possibilities. They listen not only to the present and the past, but to imagined outcomes. This allows for extraordinary flexibility. You can avoid danger you have never encountered. You can prepare for opportunities that have not yet appeared. You can learn from mistakes you have not yet made. But it also introduces a unique vulnerability. Because imagined futures feel real, the body responds to them as if they were happening now. A thought about an upcoming challenge can tighten muscles. A worry about a distant event can disturb sleep. A regret about the past can echo repeatedly, long after the situation has ended. In this sense, humans are time travelers who cannot turn the machine off. The same system that allows for creativity, planning, and meaning also opens the door to anxiety and rumination. The brain does not always distinguish cleanly between what is happening and what is merely being imagined. This is not a flaw, it is a consequence of depth. The ability to model the future relies on richly interconnected feedback loops. Sensory information, memory, emotional value, and bodily state all feed into the simulation. The more accurate the model, the more useful it becomes. But accuracy requires emotional realism. A future that does not feel real would not guide behaviour effectively. This is why regret can feel sharp and hope can feel warm. They are not abstract concepts. They are experiences generated by the same machinery that processes the present. When consciousness is shaped by future simulation, the self stretches across time. You're not only who you are now, you're also who you were and who you expect to become. Identity becomes a moving pattern rather than a fixed point. This helps explain why changes in life can feel disorienting. When plans collapse or futures shift, it is not just the present that is affected. An entire internal landscape must be redrawn. At night, as external demands fade, this future-oriented machinery often becomes more active. With fewer immediate tasks to anchor attention, the mind drifts forward and backward through time. This is why worries surface at bedtime and why imagination can feel vivid in the dark. Yet this same capacity also allows for something gentler. You can imagine rest, you can imagine relief, you can imagine a quiet morning or a peaceful ending to the day. The future is not only a source of stress, it is also a place where comfort can be rehearsed. Understanding this can change how we relate to our thoughts. Instead of treating every imagined future as a demand, we can see it as a simulation, useful but not mandatory. A story the brain is testing, not a prediction carved in stone. This perspective fits naturally with everything we have explored so far. The interpreter narrates actions after they occur. Competing processes vote on what enters awareness. Feedback loops build models of increasing depth. Future simulation is simply the next layer. It does not replace the present, it wraps around it. As we approach the final part of our journey, this understanding will become essential. Questions about free will, responsibility, and choice all hinge on the timing of decisions and the role of awareness. To explore those questions calmly without alarm, we must first understand how deeply the future already lives inside the present. For now, let this image settle softly. A body resting in one place. A mind walking gently ahead, testing paths, imagining outcomes, and then slowly returning, bringing with it not certainty, but perspective. By the time we reach this point, the idea of a single commanding self has already softened. We have seen how actions can begin before explanations arrive, how thoughts compete quietly for attention, and how imagined futures can feel as real as the present. Now we come to a question that has unsettled people for centuries, but feels especially delicate when viewed through the lens of neuroscience. If the brain begins deciding before you become aware of the decision, what does that mean for free will? This question gained new attention when scientists began measuring the timing of brain activity related to simple choices. In these studies, people were asked to perform an uncomplicated action, something like moving a finger whenever they felt the urge to do so. At the same time, their brain activity was recorded. What researchers noticed was subtle but important. A gentle build-up of neural activity appeared slightly before the person reported the conscious intention to move. Not long before, not dramatically earlier. Just a small fraction of a second ahead. This finding was often described in alarming terms, as if it proved that free will was an illusion. But that reaction moves too quickly, and it misses something essential. The brain is not a single switch that flips from undecided to decided. It is a flowing system. Preparation happens gradually. Signals rise and fall. Possibilities are weighed before anything reaches awareness. By the time you notice the intention to act, the process has already been underway for a while. This does not mean you're absent from the process. It means you're not the starting gun. Think of a wave forming in the ocean. Long before it reaches the shore, forces are already at work. Wind, pressure, movement across vast distances. When the wave finally breaks, it feels sudden, but it was not spontaneous. Conscious awareness may be similar. It may arrive near the end of a long chain of preparation, not at the beginning. This reframing changes the emotional weight of the question. Instead of asking whether free will exists at the very first moment of neural activity, we can ask a gentler question. What role does awareness play in shaping behaviour over time? Free will may not be about initiating every action from scratch. It may be about guiding patterns, setting boundaries, and influencing which possibilities are more likely to arise in the first place. Your habits matter. Your values matter. Your long-term goals matter. They shape the landscape in which decisions form. The brain does not decide in isolation from the person you are. It decides as you. Even if a particular movement begins before you notice it, the conditions that made that movement likely were shaped by experience, learning, reflection, and intention across time. You're not reduced to a passive observer. You're the system that has been trained by its own history. This is why responsibility still makes sense. Responsibility does not require that every action be consciously initiated in the moment. It requires that actions reflect the enduring patterns of a person, patterns that can be influenced, revised, and guided. You're not responsible for the first spark of a thought, but you are responsible for how you respond to it. You're responsible for the environments you choose, the habits you cultivate, and the stories you reinforce. In this way, free will becomes less like a single decision point and more like a slow shaping process. The interpreter we explored earlier plays an important role here. It does not create decisions, but it helps you learn from them. By telling stories about why things happened, it allows the system to adjust future behaviour. Even imperfect explanations can still guide change. Over time, these stories influence which impulses feel acceptable, which are resisted, and which are encouraged. Awareness, then, is not a trigger. It is a witness that learns. This perspective also softens the fear that neuroscience removes meaning from life. Meaning does not depend on instantaneous control. It depends on continuity, on the ability to recognize patterns across time and care about their direction. You may not choose the moment a feeling arises, but you can choose how you live with it. You may not choose the first thought that appears, but you can choose which thoughts you return to and which you let pass. These choices are real, even if they unfold gradually. As night approaches and the mind relaxes, this understanding can be surprisingly comforting. You do not need to control every thought to be yourself. You do not need to monitor every impulse to have agency. The brain does much of its work quietly, efficiently, and without asking for permission. And that is not a threat. It is what allows you to rest. Free will, seen this way, is not a fragile illusion waiting to be exposed. It is a layered process, embedded in time, shaped by feedback and expressed through consistency rather than moment-to-moment control. As we come closer to the end of our journey, one final question remains. If the self is distributed, if consciousness is emergent, and if free will is gradual rather than absolute, what holds a life together? What makes one body, many minds, still feel like one story? That is where we will turn next. As we arrive at the end of this long and gentle journey, the question that began it all returns in a quieter form. If the brain is divided into hemispheres, layered by evolution, animated by countless feedback loops, and guided by processes that often begin before awareness, what remains of the self? What remains of you? At first glance, the answer might seem unsettling. The idea of a single inner ruler has faded. The notion of a central command issuing decisions has softened into something more distributed, more patient and less absolute. And yet, despite all of this complexity, life does not feel scattered. It feels continuous. You wake up as yourself. You remember yesterday as belonging to you. You imagine tomorrow as something you will inhabit. Something holds it all together. That something is not a location in the brain. It is not a molecule or a single process. It is a pattern that persists over time. The self, in this view, is not a ruler sitting above the system. It is the shape the system takes when its many parts move together long enough to form a recognizable flow. Like a river, it is never made of the same water twice, yet it remains the same river. Your thoughts change, your moods shift, cells die and are replaced. Even the balance between brain systems fluctuates from moment to moment, but the overall pattern, the tendencies, the memories, the values, the way you respond remains recognizable. That continuity is what we mean when we say one life. Responsibility lives here, not in the instant a thought appears, and not in the first flicker of an impulse, but in the patterns that unfold across time. You're responsible not because you initiate every action consciously, but because your actions emerge from a system shaped by learning, reflection, and care. When society holds someone responsible, it is not pretending the brain is simple. It is acknowledging that people are patterns that can change, that habits can be adjusted, that understanding can deepen, that futures can be shaped. Responsibility is not about blame, it is about continuity. This perspective allows us to keep meaning without clinging to control. It allows us to accept that much of what happens inside us is automatic, while still recognizing that who we become is not accidental. Even the interpreter, the storyteller inside the mind, plays a role here. Its stories, though sometimes incomplete, help stabilize identity. They help us remember who we are, why certain things matter, and how today connects to yesterday. The story does not have to be perfect. It only has to be coherent enough to guide behavior forward. This is why the self feels most real when life feels meaningful. Meaning arises when actions align with